There was a square of yellow paper stuck to the fridge when I opened the door, a hurried scrawl that said they were staying with a friend for a few days. No bags by the door, no shoes in the hallway. The milk in the carton had a layer of skim at the edge like a little white crescent, and the microwave hummed like it always did, making everything feel like a normal Tuesday, even though nothing about it was normal. I sat on the back steps until my knees went numb because I didn't know where else to sit. I was 13. The world at 13 feels like a house you haven't learned how to map yet. Every room might be someone else's. I remember the porch board beneath my palms, the way the streetlight threw a single yellow knife onto the pavement, the neighbor's dog barking as if that could fix anything. I remember the first absurd hope. Maybe they'd come back with a story, breathless and apologetic. Maybe it was one of those explanations that explains and then vanishes when you try to hold it. Night came, and I stayed until the porch light went out. I came in only when I couldn't feel my toes, carrying the note like a talisman that could still be charged into meaning. I tried their phones. They went straight to a voicemail I had never needed to leave before. I slept in my bed because, logically, why wouldn't I? But every creak in the house sounded like a foreign footstep. Around midnight, a car pulled up the street. Deep black paint, a grille that had been polished clear of any dust. It idled too long, and I thought maybe it was someone else. Then the passenger door opened, and a man stepped out with his coat collar up and a face like a map of small, deliberate kindness. He was Richard Carlton, the uncle on my father's side everyone mentioned at family dinners in the abstract, until they didn't mention him at all. He walked like someone who had learned to enter rooms without demanding notice, and who believed attention was a resource to be rationed. "Get in," he said. No flash, no questions. Just a voice that expected compliance and offered refuge at once. I don't remember say yes or no. I remember the warmth of the car, the smell of leather and something faintly metallic, cologne, money, and the way city lights taped a jittery marina of colors across the ceiling. He slid a paper bag to me. Inside, a burger half wrapped in wax paper and a shake that left a chocolate halo on my fingers. For the first time since the note, my stomach quieted. We didn't make small talk. He drove. I learned his face in profile. Sharp nose, a ratcheted smile that softened only when he talked about ordinary things as if they were important. We rolled past the same streetlights, and he pointed to a diner like someone showing me a favorite spot on a map that had once seemed private. He let me order anything on the menu. I took a grilled cheese and a chocolate malt, and ate like I hadn't eaten in days. Across from me, he read the room as if he'd spent a lifetime cataloging what people left behind. "No one sleeps on a porch in the winter," he said for himself. Not anymore. That night was my first lesson in what he called inheritance that wasn't money. Habits, attention, rules you could live by. When we drove to his house afterward, it felt like being invited into a carefully arranged life. The foyer smelled faintly of citrus and furniture wax. The guest bedroom had a bed with crisp sheets, a lamp that cast a soft cone of light, and a glass of orange juice on the nightstand. I don't remember ever seeing orange juice poured into a real glass at home. He didn't offer me a story about my parents. He didn't ask for mine. He sighed once, the kind of human sound that said he'd done this before, even if he hadn't. "You can stay," he said, and left the sentence there, stripped of ceremony. He placed a small leather-bound journal on the pillow. It was worn at the edges as if it had been used to carry ideas around like coins. "That's for you," he said. "Write what matters." I slept in a bed where the mattress didn't dip like a sigh when you sat on it. In the morning, there were eggs cooked the way someone who knew how to care would cook them. Not experimental, not fussy, just done right. He introduced a few rules like someone removing knots from a rope. "Stand up straight," he told me, and I thought it was about posture. It wasn't. It was about how to exist without shrinking. His ways were not sentimental. He believed in practical care. He would, in his clipped way, help me schedule a dentist appointment, make sure I had the school forms filled out, and show me how to open a bank account. He taught me to keep receipts and to register things in a ledger he called my proof. He never asked for my gratitude. He assumed we would show it later in the form of habits. There were moments, small ones, that felt like miracles precisely because they were not theatrical. He learned, one by one, my allergies, my preferred tea, the odd hours when I was most likely to call home and be disappointed. He gave me a bracelet with a cheap steel clasp and told me to keep it for luck. It turned out to be an emergency tether when I had to buy work shoes and couldn't spare the cash. The journal collected these small acts and my responses to them, anger, gratitude, confusion, like a ledger of belonging. Things exist to be used, he wrote once in that journal, in the clear slant of someone who was more comfortable with verbs than with affection. I kept that line because the earliest days felt like survival theater. Me learning to use a spoon, a bus pass, a school schedule. He taught me the economy of presence. If you showed up, he would notice. If you didn't, the world would not clumsily apologize. Early on, I mistrusted generosity. My mother and father had left me a note. That experience had made me allergic to hands that unclenched too quickly. When Richard paid for a school supply or took me to the optometrist, a wedge of suspicion slid under my ribs. It was easier to believe in hard things, rules, receipts, simple transactions, than in an unexpected kindness that might require repayment in some mythic coin. So I repaid him the only way I could, by learning to do the little things correctly. I learned to iron my shirts just so. I learned to fill the dishwasher in his precise pattern, plates facing the same direction, cups nested by size. It felt silly at first to measure my gratitude in detergent decisions, but there is a dignity in tending the same small chores that make a life livable. The leather journal became a kind of backbone. I wrote under lines he'd supply, a practice that made me feel both accountable and extraordinary. I'd write one sentence and close the cover, like offering a small private altar. The journal had very few long entries at first. Mostly, it hosted fragments. A sentence about a test that had gone poorly, a list of scholarship deadlines with deadlines circled in red, a note on the first time I said no to someone in my grade without feeling like a traitor. Richard's handwriting popped up sometimes, short aphorisms, a quip, a correction like a bookmark in my life. Posture, he'd scrawl, not just your back. You'll learn, he'd add beside a penciled list of things to do. Don't let life make you small. He made me practice it, standing in the hallway, straightening my shoulders, removing the slouch I had grown accustomed to like a second skin. There is power in being seen stand upright. People treat you differently when you occupy space like you plan to stay. School was its own sort of tide. I went from being the kid who carried a note home to being the kid who raised his hand in math. I took a job bagging groceries because Uncle Richard refused to let me float on his money like a coin in a pond. He believed in earning one's place in the world, not buying it. The first job smelled like cardboard and lemon-scented sanitizer, and the small, brittle triumph of sending home a fistful of paychecks. I bought my own coat with the first check, then discovered a strange, humbling joy in having choices that weren't whispered or begged for. There were other lessons, practical, blunt, and oddly tender. He taught me to manage a savings account the way someone taught me to plant a seed, small deposits that would someday mean shade. He played no movie-length speeches about independence. Instead, he handed me a notebook with 3 headings: income, expenses, goals, and told me to keep them close. You can't run a building with a blind eye, he said. Apply the same to your life. He held me to standards and refused to sentimentalize my parents' absence. He didn't call them monsters. He called them fallible humans who had chosen a path that didn't include me that day. When I asked him once, quietly, if it was abandonment, he avoided the word, as if it were a loose tile on a porch. Sometimes people move through the world as if they're packing for a trip they'll never take, he said. You don't own their journey. There was also humor, which arrived like a secret between us. He'd toss an offhand dry joke into a serious conversation, never sign anything before breakfast, and watch me blink and then laugh. He had a habit of misplacing his glasses by doing what he called patent acts of stubbornness, placing them on his head when they were already on his nose. I would tease him about it in the journal, small, affectionate paragraphs that softened the ledgered days. Time is merciless and generous in equal measure. The first year slid into the second like a stitched seam. I learned to translate the small codes of adult life, what constituted a dinner invitation, how to read a bill, the acceptable way to refuse a pitying glance. Richard signed permission slips, attended parent-teacher conferences, and without fanfare, financed a tutoring program when school started to feel like a mountain. The community started to form around us. Neighbors who learned my name, a barista who remembered my order, classmates who knew me for debate club more than for the story I might have been supposed to be. Debate club became a place where I tried my sentences out loud and watched them land. It was where I first learned to bend an argument into a thing people could hear. I won a few small trophies, and Richard treated those like the most ordinary of landmarks, insisting we keep the receipts. Proof, he would say. Proof in ledger form. Proof printed on certificate stock. Proof in conversations I'd carry to interviews, and eventually to job applications. There were nights, too, that felt like replays of that abandoned Tuesday, a silence at the dinner table, an absence that couldn't be remedied by orange juice or a straight back. I'd write about them, short lines, feverish, then carefully crossed out and rewritten into something steadier. The journal absorbed those versions of me, furious, lonely, grateful, bewildered. It was not a confessional so much as an evidence box, pages packed with dates, small receipts, and the occasional penciled sketch of a plan. One of my entries reads, simply, "If this house holds me, I will learn to maintain it." That's not bravery so much as a barter. I learned to do the dishes right away, even when I was angry. I learned to iron his shirts. He would smirk and say, "It's better when you don't leave tiny waves in the fabric," as if discernment were a quiet form of love. There were romance scenes, too, not the cinematic kind, but the kind that prove people will still find you. I met Ethan at the community garden, sleeves rolled up, kneeling in the dirt with a weird, earnest way of apologizing to plants he thought were struggling. He had a grin that made a small line appear around his eyes, and a habit of bringing 2 water bottles, one for himself and one for whoever he thought might be thirsty. We talked about things like soil pH and the arrogance of unripe tomatoes, and I was surprised to find how quickly I wanted to tell him the small historical facts of my life. He listened as if cataloging things. No pity, no grand promises. He was gentle and precise, a person who liked to measure things before he judged them. There was a tenderness in his curiosity. We moved slowly, texts about studies, visits to the garden in the late afternoon when the heat was less honest, weekends where we read on the same couch without speaking. He believed in small acts, too, bringing me orange slices when he thought I'd forgotten to eat, offering to help carry my boxes when I moved into a tiny rented apartment after graduation. College was less an arrival than an accumulation of small victories. Scholarship letters came in thin envelopes that felt like false promises until they weren't. I wrote essays about being left at 13 in the economy of honest sentences. One essay, in particular, gained attention. A short piece about morning light and the maintenance of things, an odd take on survival, and it got me a small scholarship for promising writers. I celebrated by buying a cheap typewriter ribbon and laying down words in the journal that felt more like plans than prayers. Uncle Richard never made a fanfare of my acceptance. He took me out for a coffee and said very plainly, "You knew how to look after yourself. Now learn to look after a thing that isn't you." He handed me a small envelope with a list of accounts and numbers that would keep my tuition from looking like a cliff. He called it his dislike of waste. Tata, the credit of his support, had boundaries that resembled respect more than obligation. Years compressed into the rhythm of study, work, and what the world insisted on being ordinary. I worked internships in construction offices, slowly learning how to translate a pencil sketch into a foundation plan. My first job as a junior civil engineer smelled like concrete and late-night excitement. I made mistakes that were costly. I learned how to apologize and fix them without feeling nullified. Work taught me the language of sturdiness, how to put things where they would stay. Richard's house remained an anchor. Friday dinners became habitual, a place to swap stories and to test new recipes. He sent postcards written in spidery handwriting when I went on short trips, small notes that had the rhythm of a man who didn't do grand gestures, but who threaded attention through days in clerk-like fashion. Once, in a postcard from a business trip, he wrote, "Keep the kettle on low, we'll talk at supper." I kept the postcard folded in the journal. There were also quiet lessons that didn't look like lessons. He let me choose the paint color for his den once, a muted blue that I thought made the room less solemn and more possible. He taught me to read contracts by asking what a clause would mean for someone at the margins. He had a way of making abstract forms feel like people. He taught me to recognize the sound of someone being honest in a sentence. It tends to leave out the theatrical flourish and stick to steady verbs. One year, in the middle of a winter that felt particularly honest, I found him at the kitchen table with a fountain pen uncapped and a list of small repairs. He'd always kept a list like that. Replace the porch light, schedule the doctor, call the plumber. On the table sat the leather journal again, as if it and I were in rotation. He slid a small piece of paper across. On it he had written 3 things: posture, proof, presence. He tapped each word like a metronome. "Promise me you'll carry these like tools," he said. "Not like guilt." I promised, because at 13 I had promised 1,000 small things to survive. But this promise was different. It had consequences. It meant holding space for myself and the people I loved, and for this I had to be practical. He didn't lecture about legacy. He spoke about maintenance. "A house," he said once, over a bowl of their very ordinary soup, "is only as dignified as the people who keep it. Legacies are just a lot of small, consistent hands." There were also the evenings when grief that wasn't mine rose like tide. The times I'd see my parents on social media, their lives curated into harmless snapshots that ignored the barnacle of absence they'd left me to scrape away. They would occasionally re-enter the periphery, messages with tentative, belated affection, invitations that looked more like tests. Jasmine, my older sister, would appear sporadically, her expressions always a study in performance grief. Lily, younger by 3 years, sent mornings where she wished me well with a briefness that suggested habit more than hurt. They did not ask for my help. They asked for re-entry. I watched them step into rooms at family gatherings with practiced faces. I watched old cronies attempt to clap me into a sister role, like slipping on someone else's coat. I kept my boundaries in the way someone sets a fence: firm posts, clear limits. Richard taught me how to respond, not with spectacle, but with precise sentences. "Thank you for reaching out," I'd say. "I appreciate that. Right now, I'm focused on my work and studies." It wasn't cruelty. It was stewardship of my emotional labor. In the journal, on a night when the house felt particularly quiet, I wrote, "The people who abandon you might come back when it suits them. You are allowed to say no to their timing." It felt like a radical declaration, and I left the line unadorned, like a date on a ledger. As the years stacked, our routines made a life. My job became a scaffold for a home of my own, a modest apartment with a balcony that I planned to grow herbs on someday. I dated Ethan seriously. He became a steady in the ledger of my life, the sort of person who would notice when a light bulb had gone dim. We talked about marriage with the pragmatic pause of two people who had learned how to inventory their feelings, what we owned, what we owed, what we wanted to build together. Meanwhile, Richard aged the way someone who had always liked to schedule things does, with notices and small adjustments. He started to take longer to climb stairs. He misplaced his keys in places like the freezer. He commented once, in a tone I still return to in the journal, "I used to think the body outlasted the list. It doesn't." He laughed it away, and so did I, because laughter felt like a useful medicine. The journal absorbed these moments too. A penciled entry about a missed beat in his walk, a pressed receipt for a visit to the clinic, a note about an extra sweater added to the closet. I didn't want to catalog decline like a specter. I wanted to observe it the way a competent engineer checks for cracks, methodically, without panic. There were moments of tenderness that felt like safety drills. The day he sat in my tiny apartment and repaired my leak in the bathroom with the same patience he gave a stubborn contract clause. The afternoon he showed up with a thermos and insisted we eat soup on the balcony, just the two of us, a ritual of ordinary consolation. He would fuss over my plain shoes as if they were blueprints of a future I hadn't yet considered. And then there were the nights when a coughing fit woke me with the same hollow dread as that fridge note. He dismissed it at first, with an offhand comment about winter's tricks, but the cough became a companion. He began to decline invitations he would have once accepted. He stopped ordering the extra bread at dinner. He started leaving small notes in the journal that I found folded between the pages, sometimes just a single line. "If they ever try to erase you, remember this." The handwriting seemed more urgent than ever, like someone whose ink was thinning but not yet out. The house started to accumulate a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the loud absence of the earlier years, but the heavy hush that enters a room when someone you depend on is no longer a given. I found myself checking my phone more often, cataloging calls, making a list of all the things that needed to be done if he were to be suddenly absent. Accounts, passwords, the tiny list of trusted neighbors who had keys. I did it like an engineer would, with a methodical hand and a stomach that wouldn't stop trying to climb up through my ribs. There is a peculiar, awful clarity that comes when you have to imagine a day without someone you thought would last. It makes you measure time differently, like a foreman inspecting scaffolding before removing a prop. You begin to practice being the person who will make the calls, who will sit with doctors, who will file paperwork you have never filed before. You make lists not because you want to do the work, but because you plan to be the person left holding the ledger. One late night, I opened the journal to a page where he had written, in a hand that trembled slightly, "If it becomes necessary, take care of the house, keep the garden. You know where I keep my emergency fund." He had tucked under that line a small legal name and an address. The entry was not theatrical. It was a practical map for someone who believed in maintenance to the very end. I folded the page and slid it into my pocket. I didn't cry then. I made a coffee and sat on the balcony of my tiny apartment and looked out at the city, thinking about porches and balconies and how you move from one to the other. The journal sat on the table between my hands, a small weight of leather and ink. I read back through earlier notes, stand tall, proof, presence, and felt the slow consolidation of a life I'd been taught to build with modest tools. He was still alive then, as I write this. He had not yet been carried away, but the ridge of future worry was there, like a foothold I had to plan for. My training was not in grief. It was in running things so they didn't fall apart. I began to practice that kind of keeping like it was another curriculum. Doctor appointments scheduled, a folder of accounts assembled, the names of attorneys written in a hand that didn't tremble. If you had asked me then what I would do with the house, if he left me anything, I would have said the obvious. Keep it tidy, pay the bills, make sure the plants didn't die. I hadn't yet imagined the will reading, the family returns, the precise hour of being declared rightful heir. Those things felt like the distant end of a hallway I hadn't chosen to walk down. For now, there was only the small and sacred business of showing up, of learning to be the person who does the tending. I wrote in the journal that night, "A girl on a porch becomes someone who knows how to keep things from falling." The line felt like a promise and a forecast. I meant it to be both. The cough started as something I could habitually ignore, an inconvenient noise you tell yourself is seasonal, and not a syllabus. He said little, as if words might draw attention to the body, and the body would, in protest, do what bodies do when named. He missed a couple of his usual calls, then a dinner. He left a folded note on the kitchen table. "Feeling off. See Dr. Grace." The handwriting was patient, unshowy, the sort that had learned to be exact because it trusted precision more than flair. I found myself rereading that note at odd hours, a detective tracing the shape of his days. I scheduled the appointments he'd asked me to schedule months earlier. I learned how to describe symptoms in a medical room. Short, measured phrases like, "He's been more tired," or "He walks slower." The clinicians listened and ordered tests and said the things clinicians say, words with a practiced, moderate cadence meant to hold worry in its small, manageable box. He shuffled into the clinic the way men who are not used to being cared for shuffle, apologetic on the edges, as if he were invading someone else's calendar. Then it happened the way a small failure reveals a structural flaw. He collapsed at his office late one evening. I was the one he called from the security gate, voice thin with something like fright. I remember the smell of antiseptic and old coffee when I ran down to him. I remember the sound of a siren becoming a drum. The hospital room was suddenly a different kind of house, bright, fluorescent, a bed that hissed like a small machine. The edges of his face looked sharper when he was sleeping. There was a patient geometry to his features that the years had smoothed into someone who knew how to be practical with his expressions. I sat with him. I read journal fragments aloud, something he'd once called a polite form of carrying memory. He smiled at the page like a man who'd surprised himself by being proud of a utility. "Keep reading," he murmured, which was his way of asking me to perform a modest piece of reassurance. I read aloud an old entry. "Stand tall, keep receipts, return calls." His laugh came out small and real, and for a moment the hospital felt like a room in his house, tidy and holdable. There were quiet conversations at the foot of the bed, practical directions, names of neighbors, how to access the safe deposit box. He worried more about the details of how his plants would be maintained than about his own breath. "Don't let the garden go brown if you can help it," he told me, eyes steady. "Plants are honest." He handed me, then, the journal, one he'd kept for himself this time, pages crowded with lists and marginalia. He asked me to take it home and to copy anything I thought I might need. "You know how I keep things," he said. "If it matters, write it down. If it doesn't, throw it away." On a late afternoon that smelled of hospital coffee and the disinfectant sting of long corridors, the doctor used the word we all had been avoiding. It landed like a clause in a contract I couldn't negotiate. He died with his hand folded into mine, the skin thin and warm like the last page of a book. I held the journal to my chest as if it were a shroud made of ink and small orders. When the nurses escorted me out, the corridor felt too bright. Once again, I found myself cupping a small piece of paper as if it might redirect everything. Funerals rearranged time into ceremonial, tidy segments. Friends and some colleagues arrived with subdued faces and envelopes of condolence. I watched neighbors who had once waved across hedgerows now approach with careful steps. They spoke of him as though naming his efficiencies would hold him in the room. He was a man of lists, always delivered. They used the kind of praise that tried to fit a whole life into a single tidy seam. Then, like a slow tide, my name reappeared in rooms I assumed had forgotten me. People who had been absent for years began to call. Messages arrived with an economy of pronouns. "We heard about Richard," and an undertone of logistical interest that felt like hands checking for a seat at a table. My parents called. Their voices were quiet and polite, calibrated for an entrance. Jasmine wrote to say she was so sorry and asked about arrangements as if checking a box of grieving. Lily's messages were brief, intermittently warm, like short radio signals from a shore I had stopped trying to reach. There was a procedural choreography to be learned when someone who'd been your steady-handed over everything stops moving. Mr. Halpern, the attorney Richard had trusted for years, led the first meeting with a competence that felt like comfort and a formality that felt like distance. He sat behind a mahogany table that reflected the strip of window light in a careful way, the room itself lined in books with the faint smell of lemon oil. When he placed the envelope with the will in front of me, it looked like any other piece of paper, except paper bound by legal language tends to hum with decision. 15 years, he said. That's a long time to build a life with someone. I nodded, because what else does one do when someone else reads back the gravity you already carry? He cleared his throat. The room was quiet except for the small sound of a clock and the soft rustle of the legal paper. The family came, my parents and sisters included, not storms but arranged like guests at a reception who had misread their own invitation. They spoke in the tight, careful rhythms of people who intended their presence to be noticed as concern. Mr. Halpern read with a precise cadence. He spoke of bequests and executors, of the kinds of clauses that turn affection into instruction. Then he read the line that would sit in my memory like a pivot. All property, real and personal, including but not limited to the residence at 12 Ashford, the vehicles, accounts, and intangible property, is hereby left to my niece Alma Mountain to be her sole and absolute property. Time did that theatrical thing where it seems to slow and compress at once. My sister Jasmine let out a breath that sounded like an exhale in a room filled with helium balloons. My mother half risen, her mouth forming a reproach that didn't quite make the sound of anger. My father, who had perfected that look of moral authority over the years, placed his palm against the table as if to steady himself. I felt a tidal mix of grief and disorientation, of an absurd gathering relief that was, to my own taste, ragged and unromantic. People ask, later, if I felt vindicated. It is an easy word, and not quite the one that fit the shape of the moment. I felt, mostly, a steady verification, as though the ledger had been balanced, as though a life of small, consistent care had been recognized not as theater, but as the real, functional thing it had always been. The will was not a dagger. It was an administrative rendering of a trust he'd been building for years. It honored a quiet logic. The person who had tended to the details should carry them forward. There were questions, from my family and from strangers who had once been distant relations. "Why you?" my mother asked, voice threaded with the first genuine curiosity I'd heard in years. "How can this be?" Jasmine asked, her intentness more like a homework demand. They did not accuse formally. They performed surprise the way actors perform tears. They brought memories like props. I answered in the same precise way Richard had taught me to answer. Calm, factual, disarming. I cared for him, I said. He cared for me. He left the house to the person who knew how to keep it. It wasn't a defense so much as a description. The aftermath was a series of small legal rituals. We met again with Mr. Halpern, signed papers, exchanged condolences that felt a little like the clinking of cutlery, proper, functional, not designed to soothe so much as to complete. I sat through meetings about estate taxes and property titles, each one a lecture in procedural respect. I learned how to read a title deed and what a trust did. I asked practical questions about insurance policies, about the small savings he'd kept folded into envelopes, and Mr. Halpern answered with the calm of someone who deals in transitions. Journal entry. Halpern likes the word disposition. I prefer what to do next. One afternoon, after the practical business had been mostly arranged, I returned to the house that had been an anchor for so many ordinary things. The den smelled the way it had always smelled, of citrus, lemon oil, the faint tang of a well-used fountain pen. His chair sat like a small island. The good coat, a little too long on the shoulders, hung on the hall stand. I walked the rooms like a person auditing a building, checking each corner for things that would matter in the small daily way. Neighbors came by, leaving casseroles and quietly worded notes. The gardener mowed the lawn a little more carefully than usual, as if attention could be a kind of ritual tribute. I moved through the house, doing the maintenance he would have done, changing a light bulb, tightening a loose hinge, making sure the thermostat schedule made sense for the season. Each small act felt both reverent and necessary. It was not about proving anything to anyone. It was simply stewardship. Journal entry. He left me instructions like a map of a room. I am learning to read this house the way he read contracts. My parents called more often. Their calls were not all the same. Some were tentative, some oddly practical. My mother sent a message requesting certain items for closure, a phrase that sounded more like the rearrangement of memory than a real thing. My sister Jasmine dropped by with a long resume of shared childhood memories. She expected me to notice the way she cried. Lily texted a photo of her child and wrote, "Grandkids are amazing. We'd love to visit the house sometime." Each approach felt like a test of boundary. Each required a response that did not betray the ache beneath my patience. Often I read entries in the journal to steady myself. I found a line he'd left on a yellowed scrap tucked between pages. "If they arrive late, do not apologize for being already whole." I folded that scrap like a small talisman and slid it into my pocket. Journal entry. You are not the sum of who returns to you. You are the sum of care given and care kept. People, predictably, wanted to know what I intended to do with the house. Would I sell? Rent it? Keep it empty as a museum? They asked with interest tempered by calculation. My answer was, again, practical. The house was a locus of maintenance, a place where small acts layered into something durable. I could have sold it, turned the rooms into profit, and removed myself entirely from the delicate weight of inheritance. But selling felt like the removal of a story mid-sentence. It didn't feel respectful. I decided to keep the house and to honor the spirit of his instructions. Maintain the garden, keep the routine, host Friday dinners when I could. I took the role of executor with the same procedural calm with which I'd once filled out scholarship applications. There was a board of some sort to be formed, insurance to be updated, and neighbors to be consulted about rain gutters. I learned quickly to translate empathy into a schedule, who to call and when, what appointments required advance notice. It was bureaucratic, but also tender, because it was the practical translation of love. Journal entry. Keeping the house is not inheritance as trophy. It's inheritance as syllabus. Emotionally, the days bunched into tasks. There were condolences and bouquets and the awkward sorties of relatives who had never contributed to the upkeep of family lore, but now arrived with a sudden fluency in grief. They asked about keys, about access to the guest bedroom, about whether they could bring casseroles for anniversaries. I answered as if reading from a manual, kind, firm, precise. The weeks after the funeral were a blur of neutrals, bank appointments, signatures on forms, the odd newspaper obituary. Friends offered help in the form of meals and company. Ethan, steady and practical, arrived with a toolkit and a willingness to stay into the night, while I sorted boxes of papers. He folded clothes with a care that felt like a sacrament. In the evenings, we would sit on the small porch of the house and read the journal aloud, taking turns. It felt like a ritual that stitched us together in a new domestic rhythm. Journal entry. Ethan brings a wrench and stays. It's a better partnership than some essays would suggest. There was a quiet confrontation with the idea of legacy. The house was a complicated artifact, rooms filled with the small apparatus of living, furniture that had been chosen for durability, a freezer with a few labeled jars, recipes clipped from newspapers. I imagined the house empty, and then full of life again, and decided that the only way to honor Richard was to keep its usefulness intact. That meant doing the hard things, paying bills on time, calling the lawn service, teaching myself how to change the furnace filter. There was also a moral economy to navigate with my family. They moved between expressions, some sincere, some scheming, some accidental. I learned to recognize the performance of grief and respond with the exact concrete sentence that closed the door politely. "Thank you for reaching out," I would say. "Right now, my focus is on settling the estate and keeping to the arrangements we have." I never raised my voice. I never needed to. When Jasmine suggested we put the house on the market for the family, the suggestion felt both ordinary and revealing. "We could split it," she said, as if dividing a life like a pie might dull the discomfort of absence. I explained patiently that houses are not pies, and that dividing property without a plan is a way to ensure it crumbles. "What about Lily's children?" my mother asked, and I said plainly, "If they want to visit, we'll arrange a time. The house is not a revolving door." Occasionally, my parents made more pointed remarks about their own needs and struggles, a narrative that expected empathy in repayment for the emotional labor they had not once offered. I kept my sentences measured. "I'm sorry things are hard," I said. "I hope you find what you need." It was a way to hold distance without cruelty. The lesson Richard had taught about posture extended beyond shoulders. It applied to conversation and to the maintenance of boundaries. Journal entry. "Set a fence. It is not unloving. It is preservation." People talk about inheritance as an answer to past wrongs, as if money or property can stitch up an old cut. The truth is messier. Inheritance is an invitation and an obligation. The house needed practical tending. There were taxes and a gardener who wanted to be paid, a leak in the upstairs bathroom to be fixed, a neighbor volunteering to bring in the mail when I was away. The estate came with both assets and tasks. I had to think like someone who builds something to last, not like someone who wants to erase the memory of abandonment with a one-time triumph. The next year had its own calendar. I organized a hospice bed in a spare room for a neighbor who had once been Richard's friend. I hired a contractor to fix a porch step that had begun to creak. Ethan and I planted a small row of herbs in the front garden, rosemary and thyme, because his grandmother had always said they were good for soup and memory. We talked, in practical and sometimes vulnerable terms, about whether we would marry. We talked about what it would mean to hold property together. We sketched budgets as if drawing blueprints, what needed preservation, what could be repurposed. Journal entry. "Legacy is a ledger. Love is the line item that pays for upkeep." In the quiet moments, when the house was hushed and the city outside carried on in indifferent pulses, I opened the leather journal and read the last note he'd left me. A short folded page with one sentence written in a hand that had become thinner but was no less deliberate. It said simply, "If they ever try to erase you again, remember this." Underneath, a brief instruction, names of a charitable trust he'd preferred, the mailbox key location, the login for an email he used rarely, but with importance. I sat on the back porch then, the late light folding over the railing, and read that line until I felt the paper loose in my hands. The command was not about vengeance. It was a charge to remember that I had been seen, and that recognition was a moral obligation to keep the care going. It felt like being handed a final toolkit. When old family friends or distant relatives asked what I would do with the money he left, if any money was left in the account, I told them what I was planning with quiet exactness. Pay off the small debts, establish a maintenance fund for the house, allocate a modest scholarship for neighborhood students who struggled with school supplies, and create a small account earmarked for community dinners on holidays. None of these choices made the grief vanish. None of them made the absence less heavy. But they translated affection into a practical architecture that could continue into days when I would have to be the one to get up and change a light bulb alone. There was negotiation, too, with my own sense of worth. I'd always known that I earned my place through labor, but the will reading had affixed a different kind of legitimacy, a formal recognition that the person who tended to the small tasks mattered. It gave me a new context in which to practice humility with agency. I started mentoring a young woman in the neighborhood, a kid with a shy way of folding a resume. We met at the diner Richard had once taken me to, and she learned how to make a list, how to present receipts, how to keep a modest ledger. She called me Ms. Mountain at first, as if tested formality might hold her steady. Weeks later, she called me Alma without invitation, and that felt like a small, excellent victory. Journal entry. Teaching a kid to balance a checkbook is the most romantic thing I've done since college. There were times when grief caught me in inconvenient places. I would find myself in a grocery line and burst into tears over nothing, sometimes over a jar of pickles he once liked, sometimes at a small, thrifted bowl that looked like something he'd pick out for his soup. Those were private, sharp moments. They didn't require explanation. They required tissues and time. Ethan learned to sit with them without trying to fix anything. He learned that presence often meant holding a teacup and being quiet. When anniversaries came, birthdays, the day he first drove up the street, the date of the note left on my fridge, I would write in the journal. My entries changed tone from frantic ledger entries to something like letters, to myself, to him, to the person I used to be on the porch. You were a small, brave thing, one entry read. You learned to keep things from falling. I underlined the sentence twice. Journal entry. I keep lists now, not to trap time, but to make a scaffold for it. People sometimes asked if the house felt like proof to me, proof that I'd been worthy of being saved. I would smile because the question contained both a compliment and an unhelpful mythology, that people are saved in one cinematic act. In truth, being saved had been a long sequence of gestures. A burger shared in a car, an envelope with a list of accounts, a man insisting I stand upright, the quiet insistence of a weekly dinner. The will's legal language had simply acknowledged what had already been true in the daily architecture of our lives. When I thought about the possible future of the estate, I imagined small, concrete continuations. A shelf in the den dedicated to neighborhood tool exchange. A ledger pinned to the kitchen wall listing volunteers to water the garden when someone was traveling. A scholarship for local kids who needed help buying lab equipment. These were modest things, but they felt like the right scale. I didn't want grand gestures. He wouldn't have either. He had always preferred utility to ornament. Journal entry. Legacy is a light bulb changed before it goes out. There was a moment, months later, when Jasmine approached me with something that looked like a fragile attempt at conciliation. She had come with the old family albums and a willingness to listen, finally, to the parts of our shared childhood she had once skipped over. We went through photographs together, us at the beach with a crooked tent, a summer where our father had pretended to teach me to fish. She cried in a careful way, and I felt my own grief loosen a little, not because of her sorrow, but because we shared a memory that belonged to both of us. There was a small, human reconciliation, uneasy and partial, but it was enough to prove that people can adjust their timing. When the house was quiet late on winter nights, I would take the journal to the balcony of my own apartment, the balcony I had always imagined in the past tense, and read a final passage. It had become a small ritual. Open the leather, find the page with his last note, let it roll into my mouth like a sentence I could repeat. Journal entry. Balconies and porches are the same thing, only one is in progress and the other is completed. Ethan and I married in a small ceremony in the back garden behind the house, not because weddings prove anything, but because it felt right to say vows in the place where so many ordinary acts of care had unfolded. There were neighbors and a few friends, and the small plates of food were passable, which made Richard's ghost smile, I think. He would have approved of the quietness. Afterwards, we sat on the porch steps and listened to the goings-on of the neighborhood, the low engines, the murmur of conversation, the occasional dog bark. It felt like the continuation of a life built from small iterations. Years later, standing on the balcony of my own place, journal open on my knees, I read the last line he'd ever given me aloud, not as accusation, not as weapon, but as benediction. "If they ever try to erase you again, remember this," I said, hearing how the sentence had been meant as a tool. I closed the leather with a finality that felt both mournful and steady. The house would continue to be a place where meals were shared, where students could borrow tools, where the old ledger hung on the wall and friends could check the schedule. It would remain a working thing as he'd wished. My life did not end at the will reading. It unfolded in the quotidian way a city breathes, one exhale at a time, with careful attention to what needed mending. Grief softened, responsibility sharpened. The estate offered me not a closed circle, but a set of tasks that required presence, patience, and a willingness to repair the small, stubborn things. Journal entry. I am the kind of person who keeps front doors painted. I like the sturdiness of that. On some nights, I open the journal and read lines he'd written across years, as if they were a litany. He had a way with short practical sentences that sounded almost like proverbs. One of them, simple and blue-penciled, used to sit on the top of the page I kept folded. "Stand tall, keep receipts, return calls." I have kept the receipt of every appliance purchase since, tucked behind that page. In the end, the visible scene reflected what had always been under the surface, a slow, patient stewardship that made belonging possible. The will reading was not a moment of triumph over those who had abandoned me. It was a quiet, administrative coronation of the person who had already been doing the work of care. It changed me, yes, gave me a practical authority and a responsibility that at times felt heavy. But it also confirmed something I had already learned on a porch when I was 13. People show up in different ways, and sometimes the person who saves you is the person who simply shows up every day. I keep the journal on a shelf in the den now, the leather spine worn and the pages stuffed with ephemera, grocery receipts, a postcard he had mailed from a trip, a pressed corner of a newspaper. Sometimes I open it and find a sentence I forgot he wrote and feel that same small astonishment, how a person can teach you something useful without grand oratory, only through disciplined attention. Journal entry. A ledger is not the opposite of love. It is a way to keep love from wobbling. If you have someone who stood in for you, an unlikely guardian, a neighbor who taught you how to pay a bill, a teacher who stamped your name with confidence, tell their story. Names matter. The people who show up deserve to be remembered in sentences, not only in hashtags. If this story finds you, and if it makes you think of a porch or a balcony where someone once waited for you, leave a line below about who kept a light on for you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories of ordinary people who built lives by keeping things working. And if you have a leather journal tucked away somewhere, take it down tonight and write a line, a small instruction, a promise, a list. The next person who needs to stand tall might find it and know they are not alone. I finish, as I have for years now, by turning one final page in the journal. The last thing he wrote there, short, precise, and blameless, feels like the room clearing after a long, practical conversation. He had scrawled one sentence, underlined twice. Keep the garden, keep the light. I close the book and place it on the shelf, a small weight of continuity. The balcony outside my apartment has a single potted rosemary plant. I water it every other morning, and when the sun hits the leaves just right, the scent travels into the kitchen like a memory made useful.